once or twice a month on OTR Essential, we're planning on doing retro reviews. Could be random shows. We may take suggestions from you in the future, or even now, whatever is fine, of what old shows you may want us to do.
Hopefully they're good.
Yeah. Or maybe some cases, maybe we hope they're bad shows to review too.
There are plenty of those out there.
You know, one other thing we would like to maybe keep them, you know, time relevant. So, like, for example, we're going to be talking about Barely Legal 1997. Now, technically, this was a pay-per-view from April of 97. However, it's close enough to where we feel that it is somewhat time relevant.
And I'll talk about ECW any day.
Especially this pay-per-view.
Yep.
When I look back at 1997, to me, it's perhaps... Whereas I think maybe 98 was the best year for the business as a whole that we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that 97 was one of my favorites because this was the year that really planted the seed for 98 and so on and so forth. You had a lot of crazy things going on, a lot of new things being tried, and some new major big stars, you know, that were really coming into their own in WWF, WCW, ECW, what have you.
Yep.
When we look at it from ECW standpoint, when you tell the story about Barely Legal 97, it really goes back to late 1996. You can't tell the story without starting off in 1996.
You are absolutely correct. Yeah. And, well, I mean, if you want to go back to how originally this pay-per-view was going to happen at the end of 96, beginning of 97, January or so, the cable companies wouldn't carry it because they thought it was either real or it was just too darn violent or, you know, just... They didn't think that it would just fit into their programming or whatever.
And keep in mind, for those of you that are maybe aren't that familiar with this or didn't watch it back then, this is at a time in the mid-90s where MMA, mixed martial arts, was basically viewed as human cockfighting.
Yeah.
You had people like Senator John McCain, you know, was calling it that, human cockfighting. And there was a huge movement across the country to have this shit banned. And
it was being touted at that time as having no rules.
Yeah, and... You know, they were sitting there saying that it was brutal and that it was not civilized and all of these things. But what happened was you have a company like ECW.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, the burden that it had was that it was grouped with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that was also, I think, part of ECW's genius.
Sure.
Because there's one thing that Heyman talked about very much in that Rise and Fall of ECW video. He talked about how much his company shook up the presentation of the wrestling business. And they very much were, like he said, like Nirvana. They really did come in and shake shit up.
And I will make the argument, and I will say this, without ECW, there probably would not have been an Attitude Era.
Oh, no question. I mean, because where would Vince ripped off some of his ideas from?
Exactly.
But when you got to 97, to me, what really started off the greatness of 97, it really starts off with ECW in the build-up with them appearing on Raw and hyping up their first pay-per-view. I mean, this was a huge fucking deal. This was also, to me, a benefit. On the DVD, you have Lawler talk about he's not really sure why they ever did it. Well, we know why he did it, King, is because he planted the seed of, hey, WWF, you never know what's going to happen. Think about the tank shit with DX in April of 98. If they would have sat there and WCW would have left the doors open and let DX come in, you would have had half of WWF's audience flip over.
Exactly.
Oh, that's Austin. That's great. You got DX in a WCW arena. Give me a fucking break. I'm going to watch that. But that's the type of spontaneity and everything else that ECW represented. And, you know, you talked about this before, about how you've had a special connection with Barely Legal because the fact it did get taken away, but it ended up coming back. And why did that happen?
I started watching ECW back in late 94, early 95. I was recording it on VHS tapes. You know this. I got piles of VHS tapes all over the place.
The glory days. I still miss VHS sometimes.
Stuff, yeah. Anyway, what had happened was that the cable companies, as I said earlier, didn't want to carry this. But the fans wrote into all these cable companies, demanded that they carry this pay-per-view, and they air it. And lo and behold, the cable companies caved in, not without some hesitation and some rules here and there, but they still carried it, and it was fan-driven, and that's what makes this more, if you were a fan at this time, your pay-per-view. This feels like my pay-per-view because I wanted it so bad, and we got it.
I agree too, and I've always felt kind of a special bond to this pay-per-view, even though it had been a few years since I watched it before I watched it again recently. I've always felt a special connection to it. And also think about it, too, for those of you that have ever watched Beyond the Mat that weren't really sure what ECW pay-per-view that was, it was this one right here. This is this one right here.
Yep.
So it was like the stars almost perfectly aligned where all these things were firing in the right area. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's some of the backstory to this. But this was a huge risk for ECW, obviously, because if this pay-per-view didn't go over well,
they were dead.
They were dead, or they were just going to slowly fade off, even if it didn't happen immediately. I mean, there was a lot of pressure here because they had WWF helping promote the event. You know, Vince was semi-bankrolling the company, which we didn't find out until a little bit later. But there was a lot of pressure here. But the payoff could be significant. A third wrestling company with national pay-per-view.
Oh, yeah.
Outstanding, as opposed to today's business, where you have one company who does okay in pay-per-view, not nearly as good as they used to do, another company who's barely a pay-per-view presence, and a third company who streams their pay-per-views on the internet.
And sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at Barely Legal 97, I think the one thing you'll agree with is that this pay-per-view is as much about storytelling, the way characters are presented, how and where they're featured, what they have them do, how everybody interconnects with each other, yet can also stand alone, more than, let's say, match quality or flow, or we have match, interview, video package, Right. If you're looking at a pay-per-view from the past, for some of those type of things that we focus on, or I do with today's pay-per-views, it's not the show for you. If you want a great historical context of what this time frame represented for us as wrestling fans, this is the type of pay-per-view. Look at the start. You know, when you look at this opening tag match, it made all the sense in the world why Heyman would book this as the opener.
Yeah, I mean, the Dudleys and the Eliminators. Who better to start off a show but to give Devon and Bubba a mic? And then you throw in Gertner?
Yeah.
Perfect. What a great way, what a great tone setter.
And I think with some of the problems that Cronus had, rest his soul, and with some of the problems Perry Saturn had, thankfully he's still with us, people forget, you know, how athletic these guys were as a tag team. They could do some crazy shit. This is, you know, from a visual standpoint, you know, it wasn't a great technical masterpiece. Who cares? It was an entertaining opener. It got you excited.
The Eliminators dominated most of the match, but, you know, who cares? You know, it was about the two best tag teams that ECW had to offer ever. Okay, maybe throw in the Gangsters too, but they weren't part of this. But those are the two best tag teams that they had to offer. Why not start it off with them? And what do you get? A title change to start off the show. Perfect.
And the people loved it. I mean, you look at it. You had the Candido promo because he was injured and he couldn't wrestle. It was not only setting up the next match, but also planting the seed that you remember this guy from WWF.
Yeah.
He's here now. Yeah. Genius. RVD versus Lance Storm. A great opportunity, you know, on the undercard for two younger guys to establish that they can go.
Right.
And, you know, you were talking about RVD. This was a guy back at that time that I loved tremendously because he was just 420. He was cool. He was laid back. He was an innovator. He was innovative. His in-ring style was unique. The way he acted, the way he dressed, the way he carried himself was unique. The way he talked was unique. So many things about RVD back in 1997 were unique. I loved Rob Van Dam back in the first 7 or 8 years that I watched him. No question about it. A good showcase match for both of these guys.
Absolutely.
But just as much as a good showcase, again, this was about storytelling. And RVD, his promo afterwards, set up something later on in the night.
Exactly.
The one thing that was kind of randomly thrown in, but I still think in a way told a story in its own right, was the Michinoku 6 match.
Yeah.
This was thrown in there because of what?
Well, because McMahon wanted to take a look and see what other talent was out there that he couldn't really get his hands on or didn't really want to touch. We're assuming, of course. And, well, I mean, he did end up picking up Taka, you know, so I would have to say that this was probably almost a tryout match for everybody involved.
I kind of view it not only as a tryout match, but again, when we talk about Heyman, you know, his desire, or out of necessity, I think, with ECW and WCW and WWF rating him, he had to go to other places. He had to go to Mexico. He had to go to Japan.
And the fans ate it up.
Yeah, they liked it.
They loved it.
Yeah, it was fine. It had some good moments, you know. That's all I asked for out of this. Yeah. Another match that had that was just as much, if not more so, about story than the actual in-ring action. I can really barely tell you anything that happened during this match at all, but I can remember the story that set it up. I know the story that played out throughout the match, and I know what happened afterwards.
I still remember the 3 pile drivers though that Shane Douglas gave Pitbull number 2, and he still got up.
Now, this is true.
Okay, so
But if that happened, but to be fair, if that happened in today's business, and we are all guilty of this,
yeah.
we would shit can this and say, what terrible job of selling that.
Exactly, but you're right. The end of this match was more important.
You've got Pitbull number 1 sitting outside with the neck brace.
Yeah.
And then the whole
Halo. Oh my god.
the whole fucking thing about him.
Oh.
The whole masked man. Is it Rick Rude? It's Rick Rude, but it's not Rick Rude, but is it Rick Rude?
It kind of looks like Rick Rude.
But then it was fucking Brian Lee when he got unmasked.
Oh,
and Rude was wearing the fucking riot gear.
Yeah.
But that's what part of what the greatness of ECW was.
Anything could happen.
It was anything could happen. You had this going on, but this guy came in, this guy came in, and this guy came in.
Right.
Again, if it happened in today's business, you would probably be saying, "Oh, this is overbooked all the hell," and we probably would too.
Yeah.
The match that had the most story going into it, no question, was Sabu versus Taz.
We were looking forward to this for a year and a half. And what's funny about this, you may find this to be funny out there, but believe it or not, these guys didn't even touch each other for a year and a half.
Yeah, anytime they tried to tease it, they were going to, but they never really did. And that was the genius of it. By the time you got to this point, you had your monster. You had your big special attraction match that wasn't for the belt.
Right.
Taz was hot at this time. Sabu was hot at this time.
The human suplex machine.
It was cultivated right by Heyman.
It was beautiful.
Perfect characters. You had the great catalyst in the middle with Alfonso. You know, you could sit there and say it kind of had a disappointing payoff. I don't think so, because this is where we talked about with Rob Van Dam earlier in the night. It's set up for what happened later in the night here when him and Sabu, attacked Taz.
Right.
Aligning themselves both with Alfonso,
yeah,
and setting up in motion what happened the next couple of months. Brilliantly done as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Everything about this feud was done brilliantly. They just don't build feuds like this anymore.
It's very interesting, too, that the Triple Threat #1 Contenders match, it was very interesting the fact that this was so late in the pay-per-view, that basically they were going to do this match and then the main event.
Yeah, I kept thinking that, okay, they're going to have another match shown in between, you know, to give whoever won this match a break before they went in against Raven.
But this is extreme. This was different. And I think this was genius. VWO.
Yeah.
That was fucking awesome.
That was great.
Parody done right. The Sandman. You know, to me, the Sandman, as far as I'm concerned, he could just do his fucking entrance. That was worth popping for. The match, who cares? No offense to the Sandman, but god damn it all. His entrance was fucking spectacular, and he knew it. Whether he was drinking or smoking, he made sure he took his sweet-ass time.
Exactly. And this wasn't your normal three-way match that you see on WWE anymore. This was an elimination match.
Yeah.
So once you beat one guy, you still got to keep going. You know,
and think about
beat
this.
The other guy too.
We think about this, and we compare it to today's product. You had Terry Funk win this match. Then you get him versus Raven, basically. Right away.
Boom, just like that.
And Terry Funk ends up going over Raven. And there's all this shit, you know, you've got fucking Tommy Dreamer. Who did he throw off of the balcony?
Big Dick Dudley.
Yeah, Big Dick Dudley. And then he comes out and he interferes with Raven. I mean, you got all this shit, all this interference going on, and you have the 53-year-old guy win this company's world title.
Open, still wins.
On their first pay-per-view. Yeah. If it happened today, we would shit all over this.
Probably so.
But it was the right place, the right time, the right moment, and even afterwards. I always disputed one thing, though, when Heyman said that if the lights would have went out while the show was still on the air, like right after Terry Funk won, that would have killed him. I think that would have helped him even more.
I think it would have helped him. Why not?
But your final grade on this show?
I give it an A. A strong A. Yeah.
When you look back on the show, ultimately, what does it represent to you?
Ownership. I owned this one. This was ours. This was every ECW fan at that time. This was our moment. This was the fans' moment right here.
Please, please, if you've never watched this pay-per-view before, go back, find it, buy it, whatever, watch it. Understand how a great wrestling product that shakes things up can be done on a somewhat shoestring budget. For me, for what this needed to do for ECW, for what this show needed to represent, to me, this was a 100% A+ show. I make no apologies for that whatsoever. This is a show I'll have no problem going back over the years and watching over and over and over again. And what it ultimately represents to me is the good things about being a wrestling fan. Yeah, they might not be here as much anymore, but by God, it was moments like this that I live for and I still look for out of the wrestling business. Thanks you guys so much for watching.